Well, thanks very much to the organizers for putting together what promises to be a really great conference and for including this paper on the agenda. And thanks to all of you for coming out early on the first morning, the first day to attend this session. I appreciate it. In this paper, we're going to examine whether price-linked incentives can be effective in helping consumers improve their financial behavior, particularly whether they can help consumers pay down their high-interest debt burdens. So the idea to use price-linked or lottery-linked incentives to try to promote positive financial behavior is not new. This has been around for many years. But almost invariably, this has come in the form of price-linked savings. We're trying to make savings more attractive and fun by turning deposits into entries in the lottery. So one example of how this works is every time someone makes a $25 deposit into a dedicated savings account or a CD and keeps it there for a pre-specified amount of time, this gives them one entry into a raffle, which is usually for a cash prize. So programs featuring these incentives have been popular internationally for many years. One example is the UK's Premium Bonds program, which is over 50 years old, and around 40% of the British public participates. And collectively, they've saved more than £25 billion in these accounts. Programs featuring these incentives have been much slower to catch on in the US, due in no small part to the fact that until relatively recently they were illegal, but that's since changed. And the first large-scale demonstration program was launched by Doors to Dreams with 8 credit unions across Michigan in 2009. And they found pretty substantial consumer response. So a lot of people opened accounts that featured these incentives and deposited substantial sums into them. More recently, Walmart launched their Prize Savings campaign, introducing prize-linked incentives onto their prepaid card, and also saw some pretty substantial consumer response. So they advertised that as of 2019, $2 billion had passed through these accounts. It's a bit unclear what they mean by pass-through, but again, some evidence that there's some demand at the consumer level for programs that feature these types of incentives. And more recently, there's been a proliferation of legislation across the US across states to allow financial institutions to offer programs featuring these incentives. And so I think this is all well and good. Savings is certainly an area in which we struggle. But one issue is that for many consumers, it's not so much a lack of savings that's the main threat to their long-term financial health. It's that we're carrying around large, high-interest debt burdens. So unsecured household debt in the US recently exceeded $1 trillion. So here I'm stripping away mortgages and auto loans and just looking at unsecured debt. As you might guess, the bulk of this is credit card debt. So at $829 billion of that, over $1 trillion. And among households that have unsecured debt, on average, they owe about $20,000. And this problem is particularly acute at the lower end of income distribution, where households in the bottom income quintile, if they hold household debt, owe about $19,000 on average, which is almost double household income for this group. And the interest rates to service this debt can really just be crippling. So it's not uncommon to pay 15 to 20% APR on credit card debt. Those with less than stellar credit might face 20 to 30% APR on personal loans. And the implied interest rate on a standard payday loan where you pay $15 to borrow $100 for 2 weeks is 390% APR, so just staggering. Right? And so for consumers who are carrying around debt like this, it's likely more financially advantageous for them to place their marginal dollar towards debt reduction rather than put it towards savings, even if that savings account includes price-linked incentives. And so for those of us that intervene in the field and partner with institutions to nudge consumers to use their money one way or another, I think we should keep this in fact in the back of our minds that many, many consumers really have large high-interest debt burdens, and that may be the highest return to whatever money we can get them to move from bucket A to bucket B. All right, so why might price-linked incentives help consumers either build up savings or reduce debt? So there's a few reasons ex ante why we might expect these types of incentives to be motivating. First, we know from a lot of previous research and prospect theory that we tend to overweight small probability events. They have disproportionately large impacts on our behavior. So the lottery itself is a really great example of this, right? There's a vanishingly small probability that anyone's going to win the Powerball, but this doesn't stop people from placing large amounts of money to the hope that they're going to win this really life-changing sum of money, which has very little chance of occurring. They might also help combat present bias. So when we ask people to pay down debt or build up savings, essentially what we're asking them to do is exchange consumption today in exchange for improved financial well-being at some point in the future. So present bias is working directly against us in this context. And by introducing incentives that make rewards to these behaviors a bit more tangible and immediate through the prospect of an immediate award may help reduce present bias behavior.
By present bias, do you mean just high discount rate?
Placing an extreme, well, not just high discount rate, so valuing the present discontinuously from the future. So I really care a lot more about today than I do about distance today to point X than point X.
Like quasi-hyperbolic.
Exactly. Yeah. At the basis level, introducing these incentives might just appeal to excitement by introducing an element of chance. And people that enjoy gambling may be nudged to use these incentives or use accounts that feature these incentives as a substitute for their normal gambling behavior. Alternatively, of course, it may be that the consumer response we just discussed and the Walmarts and Doors to Dreams programs was driven largely by selection. Right? So people who are going to save money anyway might be shifting money from bucket A to bucket B, and there might be all selection and very little, if in any way, causal behavior change after the introduction of these incentives. So there is some evidence on the pricing savings side looking at whether or not these programs introduce new savings. So Tufano and his colleagues looked at the Doorways to Dreams intervention and also conducted a survey, and they find that there is substantial consumer interest, at least self-reported, in these types of products, and it appears to be concentrated among economically vulnerable households. So Sean Cole and colleagues look at a pricing savings program in South Africa and find really complementary results to Tufano et al. That there seems to be a lot of demand for these programs. People are opening a lot of accounts and saving substantial sums within them. They also find some pretty suggestive evidence that they may lead to new savings or new savers, but they can't get to causality because the incentives are not randomly assigned across individuals. There are a couple of studies that have randomized these incentives in very controlled laboratory environments and find that there is some evidence that they may lead to more deposits and more savings compared to a standard small but not stochastic interest rate, possibly by appealing to nonlinear probability weighting or as a substitution for gambling. I think these are potentially promising results, but some important questions about external validity. I think it's one thing to introduce these incentives in very controlled environments and see that, yes, some people are willing to place more money in a pricing savings account if you give them money to save rather than a small non-stochastic interest rate. But it's another thing to introduce these incentives in the wild and ask people to bring up money to the table out of their own pocket and then use that in a financially responsible way. I think that's a much harder lift. And the only randomized study that I'm aware of is Paul Gertler and colleagues looked at a short 2-month pricing savings initiative in Mexico that was randomized across bank branches, and they found a very small absolute effect on the extensive margin, so people opening new accounts, and essentially no effect on the intensive margin. So people that had accounts existing at the bank didn't build up their savings within them. So I think this is a really nice study. I like it quite a lot. There's questions about how much people knew of the presence of these incentives and understood them in this context, whether this might be unique to institutional features in Mexico, or whether what they find replicates in other settings, and these incentives really just don't have any effect on causal behavior change. But importantly, there's no randomized evidence that I'm aware of in the US or any other developed country context, and no studies that have randomized the allocation of these incentives at the individual level, which allows us to decompose selection and treatment effects. And to the best of my knowledge, no evidence, causal or correlational, on whether these incentives might be effective in helping consumers pay down high interest debt burdens. So that's what we're going to do in this paper. We're going to conduct a relatively large field study randomizing price incentives at the individual level, see whether or not they help consumers that have lots of high interest unsecured debt more effectively pay down those debt burdens. Particularly, we're going to examine how they affect consumer delinquencies and defaults and total amount of debt reduced. And we'll also investigate whether or not they can be introduced in a financially self-sustaining way for the provider. So there's a lot of costs at the provider level associated with delinquencies and defaults. And it may be possible to structure the incentives such that the amount of money to be awarded in prizes is offset by recouped debt that the provider recovers that in excess of the amount of money to be awarded through the incentive program. So perhaps can reduce delinquencies and defaults in a financially sustaining way for the provider. And using the individual randomization, we're going to decompose correlational effects, comparing people that take up the incentives to those who don't. So analogous to a correlational study in a price and savings setting, see how much of that is due to selection, how much is due to causal behavioral change. So to do that, got some funding from the Ford Foundation and hired a couple of research assistants from Innovation for Poverty Action. We partnered with Money Management International. So MMI is the US's largest nonprofit full-service credit counseling agency, and they offer their consumers a lot of services, including financial education, credit counseling, bankruptcy counseling, and the like. But their largest program is a debt management plan. So a debt management plan works with consumers that have lots of high-interest unsecured debt that they're having difficulty paying back on their own. And MMI goes through a painstaking process where they review a client's financial life in great detail, then come up with a affordable repayment plan such that if the consumer sticks to this plan, they'll get out of debt within 3 to 5 years. Then they intercede on their client's behalf with their creditors to reduce interest rates and late fees. And they set up a 1 monthly payment system where clients remit 1 payment directly to MMI, and MMI disperses it to a client's creditors in accordance with the renegotiated agreements. So despite the relatively heavy lift to get one of these programs off the ground and the benefits of staying within one, there's a substantial amount of drop-off. So about a quarter of people don't complete the first year, and only 1 out of 3 successfully complete the program over the entire life cycle. So certainly some of this dropout is driven by financial shocks that one really can't correct, like job loss. But there's also anecdotally a lot of dropout. People just don't want to continue with the program because it's behaviorally difficult. They're going to devote large fractions of their take-home pay towards debt reduction each month. And in about half of the exit interviews that MMI conducted, people would say, I just don't want to continue making these large payments month over month. I'm going to do it on my own. So that's the dimension on which we're going to try to intervene. We're going to do so with our Every Payment Counts rewards program, which is going to essentially turn debt repayments into entries in a lottery. So specifically how this is going to work is every time someone makes an on-time, in-full debt repayment, they're going to get entered into a monthly lottery to have $500 knocked off the balance of their existing DMP. So in this case, all money is going to go specifically towards debt reduction. And each monthly on-time in-full repayment is going to grant them 1 entry into the grand prize, which is going to be $10,000 knocked off the balance of their DMP. So these are fairly high-powered incentives from the perspective that if the median person in our study were to win the grand prize, they would become debt-free. So hopefully viewed as potentially life-changing prize amounts. And we are interested in not just whether these incentives might have an effect at all, but where in the debt repayment life cycle they might be most effective. So we stratified our randomization across 3 cohorts, namely those who were new to the DMP, so those who were just starting in 2016. Oh, I should say we ran 12 monthly lotteries through the 2016 calendar year and then drew the grand prize at the end of that year. So our hypothesis was that this might be most effective to people that are just starting out. Yeah, go on.
So can you get more than 1 ticket into the lottery? Do you get more?
So we wanted to set up the incentives that way, but seems it would have been illegal, so we were prevented from doing that. So they can only get one entry. What specifically, everyone makes one monthly payment, so there's not potential to get more entries by making more payments, but they could pay more than their target amount. We tried to incentivize that, but got shot down by the lawyers. I spent a lot of time talking to lawyers, getting this good.
No, it's illegal in the US because it would be essentially you taking the state's monopoly to authorize gambling.
That's right.
I mean,
yeah.
So it's not just a casual thing, it's quite endemic.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, this is changing at a state level quite rapidly, but yeah, that's why they were illegal initially.
Is the lottery prizes for every participant the infra-marginal? Any people that have lower amounts of that?
Yeah, so yes, that could have happened. It didn't in this case. So we told them it was up to this amount. So if someone had $6,000 on their DMP and won the grand prize, we couldn't let them pocket the $4,000. That also appeared like it was going to be illegal. So they just got up to this amount, and if it was more than the amount in their DMP, they were just debt-free, go on their way. So we thought these incentives might be most effective for people who are just making the behavioral changes required to be successful within the context of this program. But we also wanted to investigate whether those who have been in the program for a while might need a little boost to get over the finish line. So we drew a sample people that are 1 year into the program and 2 years into the program, so getting close to program completion. So we have some pretty nice data to look at effects of this intervention. Particularly, we have credit reports that we called at baseline at the 1 year mark, so right after the removal of incentives. And then the 2 year mark to see if any effects we observe in year 1 persist after the removal of the incentives. We also have 2 years of MMI's administrative data, which captures things like payment behavior, debt balances, delinquencies, defaults, and the like, as well as some very limited demographic data that they collect at program intake, namely age, gender, and number of dependents. And then we have all the data from our marketing efforts, including take-up of the incentives, responses to our emails and our newsletters, and our phone outreach program, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So here is a lot of numbers. This is information about people in our sample, and this is going to be really broadly representative of the DMP population at large. So at baseline, on average, people are going to have about $15,000 in unsecured debt. This is mostly credit card debt, which they owe to about 5 or 6 creditors. They're going to have a little more than 3 years remaining on their DMP, and going to pay about $475 towards this unsecured debt each month. So this is in addition to any payments they might have on auto loans or mortgages. And this DMP payment is going to comprise about 18 to 20% of their monthly take-home payment. So a fairly sizable fraction of their cash flow devoted specifically to their unsecured debt. As you might imagine, this is a heavily subprime program. So consumers' average credit score is about 614. About $100,000 of debt appearing on their credit report, and substantial evidence of difficulty repaying debt in the past. So they have about 35, 36 incidents of late delinquent payments on their credit reports. These people are not the most destitute group in the US. So average monthly take-home pay after taxes is about $3,000. So this is really middle-class households who have trouble running up and then paying down a lot of debt. And about 11 to 12% of these people had declared bankruptcy in the past for accruing more debt and then entering a debt management program. So as I mentioned before, we have pretty great administrative data on financial behavior and characteristics, but pretty limited information on demographic characteristics. And so we know age. Average age is about 48 years old. Borrowers in this program have 2.5 dependents on average. About 18% of people are on a DMP with a co-client, which is almost invariably their spouse. There's some good deal of missingness in reports to gender and race. About a third of people don't answer those questions, but among those who do, 2/3 identify as female, a little less than 2/3 identify as white. And as I showed you before, the bulk of our sample is going to be people that are new to the DMP and just starting their repayment life cycle. So importantly, all the univariate differences on all these observable dimensions are small and not economically meaningful or statistically significant. In the fourth column here, I'm looking at whether these characteristics jointly predict treatment assignment, and they don't. So the p-value here is going to be close to 1. There's a sample of people for whom we are unable to match to the credit bureau data, but it's not very large. But in the event, I look at the balance again. Specifically for this sample, we're going to look at in terms of our credit bureau analyses. And again, all evidence suggests that the randomization worked as intended, and we're pretty well balanced on observable characteristics, which is good news.
Just a quick two clarifying questions.
Sure.
At baseline, you don't have anything on consumption, is that right?
We have essentially how much slack they have in their budget, so they go through normal spending, but we don't know how their consumption breaks down.
So you're not going to know how much their consumption drops when they observe they reduce their debt, which of course is a welfare loss.
Yeah, no, we don't have a great idea of where. A big threat to the study is if people are unaware or don't believe that this incentive program exists. So we went with a pretty heavy marketing campaign to try to get the offer and incentives in front of people's eyes to help them understand what's going on here. So we went with a 3-pronged enrollment approach for people in the treatment group. Particularly, they got an initial offer via email describing the program and listing interest, and then a reminder a few days later. If they didn't respond to either of our email efforts, then they were kicked into an auto-dialer campaign where we had an MMI support counselor pre-record a script describing the program, try to make a connection through the auto-dialer. If none of our auto-dialer campaign efforts reached the consumer, then we moved to a direct phone outreach prong where MMI support counselors would make calls directly to their clients at home or their place of business. And I'll talk a bit more about each of these. So here is our email. So we tried to saliently highlight the grand prize and did so also in the subject line. So we tested a few different variants of this on a different group, not included in the analyses here. And this is the version that had the highest open and click-through rates. And then we described why MMI is offering this program to pay people back for their hard work. Note that it's at no extra cost. Describe the structure and the incentives and what they need to do to win. Simply pay on time in full each month. And then to try to make it as easy as possible to lower the barriers to participation as much as possible, they could click yes directly within the context of the email to opt into the program, or click no to opt out, and let us know this is not something they're interested in doing. If they clicked yes, we gave them a little pat on the back, described again the incentives and what they need to do to win, essentially pay on time each full every month. And this picture is a good visual representation of how I felt every time someone agreed to participate in the incentive program. If they clicked no, we registered our shock and dismay. Again, reiterated, the program is no cost. All they need to do is pay on time each full every month, and gave them one more chance to change their mind and sign up. Though in practice, no one actually saw this landing page. They either responded, yes, I want to participate, or they simply ignored our first 2 emails. If they ignored our emails, then we went to this auto-dialer campaign where we had an MMI support counselor record this voice script containing substantially the same information as in the email. And at the end of the auto-dialer, consumers could press 1 to opt in, press 2 to opt out, or press 3 to talk to the support counselor. Try to make it as easy as possible to participate in the program. And if none of our auto-dialer campaign efforts made a connection, then our support counselors would call clients at home or their places of business if we had a business number for them to describe the incentives and enlist an interest. Right.
How familiar are these people with MMI before? Because this sounds like if I got these calls and emails, I think this is a scam.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So there's a really intensive process of setting up one of these DNPs. So they are pretty well trusted, and we had some questions, people, particularly after the phone calls, about what's going on here, is this a legitimate program? And so there was some of the burden to get over that, but I'll show you that take-up was pretty high in this context. So we were able to overcome that, I think.
Was there any discussion about the reasons somebody might turn this down rationally? Or was it all just sell?
So there were some people who didn't want to participate because it violated their religious beliefs, but that was all that we heard. So you'll see very few people actively chose to opt out.
So you never gave a balanced judgment. Here's why you might, here's why you might not. I'm
No.
not critical, I just want to understand.
No, yeah, so it's just, we just described, we're doing this program to pay clients back for their hard work. If you'd like to participate, you can. Otherwise, you don't have to.
Did you give them the probabilities of winning, or do you have any?
Good question. No, so we told them it depends on the number of successful entries. We could ballpark it, but we couldn't give it exactly. So this is often the case with many raffles that, in the lottery itself will give you an actual estimated probability of winning, but we didn't really know how many people were going to take up at the outset, so we couldn't really give them a clean estimate of what the probability of winning is.
Because you think the mechanism is probability weighting, then people don't have any sense of what the objective probability could be, so it's hard to test for.
Yeah, so we can't really back out what, if any effects are coming due to distorted probability weighting. That's right. So we're going to see if there's any effect overall. Yep.
Are you not worried that all this effort gives a wrong impression that this is a big deal and the likelihood of winning is significant?
So it's hard to know what's in consumers' minds, but we did always frame it as a chance of winning. So this is certainly not a deterministic program. If you pay on time in full, you might have a chance of winning. But we didn't survey people to ask them what they think their likelihood of success is going to be. We told them it was dependent upon the number of successful entries. There's a whole bunch of legalese they could also read through about the likelihood of winning, but there was no specific probability that we could assign to it.
So what is the probability, the true probability?
So, good question. I should know that off the top of my head. So there's about 1 in 2,000, 1 in 2,500 for each monthly lottery, and then dependent upon how many payments they made successfully, that would affect the grand prize. So it's not huge, but not as small as the typical lottery might be.
So I guess the problem then is that you don't know how much of an effort it was for those people to actually pay on time, because you don't see how much consumption have to cut down. Maybe it's like completely irrational to enter this lottery. There is a 1 in 2,000 chance that you win, but you have to stop eating for 3 days.
So we're not asking to do anything that I haven't already agreed to do in the DNP program. So they've already agreed to make these payments on time and full each month. So this is just an extra incentive to do that. So there's really no cost here. I don't think there's any rational reason why one wouldn't participate unless you knew tomorrow I'm going to drop out of the program. There's no additional cost to participating in these incentives.
I think my concern is that if you were to implement that at a very large scale, then you wouldn't be able to call each individual.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Yeah, so we'll talk about that at the end.
So Jeremy, I think I'm going to suggest that we keep our questions to the end as a discussion after the presentation. So if you have clarifying questions, I think this is good during the presentation.
Okay.
If not, let's hold up towards the end. These are all great questions, but just to improve the flow.
No more questions. All right. So everyone in the treatment group got one additional touch point. So we sent monthly reminders about the existence of the program in the form of newsletters, which again was trying to show people that these incentives are active and people are winning. And we would elicit a quote from the previous month's winner, and here this person talked about how awesome it was to win this $500. And if the person in the treatment group hadn't already signed up, then they saw this portion in the newsletter, which again this is sent via email would allow them to click yes, I participate, or no, I'm not interested. All right, so what happened? So in total, we saw some pretty strong consumer response to these incentives. We had a lot of success with our marketing efforts. About 3/4 of people in the treatment group elected to take up the incentives. And this is a little bit higher in 2016 than the other two cohorts, and that difference is statistically significant, consistent with it being easier to get someone's attention in 2016. There's a lot of steps that one needs to go through to successfully set up a DMP. There's a lot of interaction and a lot of trust with a support counselor. Only 6% of people actively elected to opt out and told us this is not something I want to participate in. And about 20% of people didn't respond one way or other to any of our marketing efforts. So before moving to causal behavior change, first I'm going to show you correlational effects comparing people who took up the incentives to those who did not. So sort of akin to a non-randomized price-linked savings study. So this is going to be some combination of selection and treatment effects. And this program, or this graph is showing you the fraction of clients that paid on time and in full each month, conditional on remaining in the program. And it's tricky to see here, we'll see it later in the tables, but there is a difference on average across the first 12 months of the program, with essentially no difference in months 13 through 24. But where there's a much bigger difference is on programmatic retention. So people that actively selected or chose to take up the incentives are much less likely to drop out of the DMP than people who did not enter these incentive programs. And this difference is observable in month 1 and grows over time during the active incentive period. So here is how things look like in our regression specifications. So mostly here I'm running individual fixed effects models, except for in column 1, since we don't have a measure of on-time payment behavior at baseline for new clients. And we see that while the incentives are active, people that selected into the program were a little bit more likely to pay on time and in full, 1.6 percentage points, and then this vanishes after the removal of the incentives. But there's much larger differences on programmatic retention. Okay, so takers were about 11 percentage points more likely to stick with the DMP program, and this is mostly coming from a reduction in unsuccessful dropouts. But interestingly, I think people that actively elected into the incentives were also less likely to successfully complete the program during the period the incentives were active. We'll come back to that in a few slides. Consistent with remaining in the program, people that took up the incentives paid off more of their DMP debt. All right, and this really compounds over time. We're at a monthly level. At about month 6 or 7, these differences start to become statistically significant. And over the 24 months, we're able to observe programmatic takers are going to pay off about $2,000 more of their debt than program non-takers. We also see differences on their credit report. So this is largely debt outside of the DMP program. And we see that they're much less likely or have a substantially lower amount of debt charged off or written off by their creditors as unrecoverable. And also have fewer late payments, about 6 fewer late payments appearing on their credit report than program non-takers during the period in which the incentives are active. And this grows to about 11 fewer late payments after the incentives are removed. No differences on the credit score dimension, which is not too surprising in this context. All people in this program have really suppressed credit scores, and it's really a black mark to be in a DMP. So while someone's actively in a DMP, it's very hard to move their credit score because they have this huge black mark that they're in a restructured debt agreement. And we find negative point estimates on total non-mortgage debt, but not statistically significant and relatively imprecise compared to some of our other estimates. All right, so all of this is purely correlational, right? It's some combination of selection and treatment effects, which we can't decompose, except we can when we use our randomized allocation incentives across individuals. So that's what I'm going to do now. And so here, this is the chart analogous to the chart we saw before, where comparing the fraction of people that paid on time and in full each month, but now across the randomly assigned treatment group and the control group, and there's really absolutely no difference. Okay? No difference at all in any of the months in which the incentives are active, and the same is true after the incentives are removed. So this is conditional on remaining in the program, and no difference whatsoever in programmatic retention. So again, none of even the pairwise month comparisons are different over time, either in the incentive period or in the post-incentive period. So if we look at this in a regression specification, right, our estimated, our point estimate on the likelihood that someone in treatment is more likely to pay than someone in control is less than a percentage point, which is true of also all of our point estimates on maintaining an active account or completion, and our point estimate on total DMP balance reductions, it's less than $50. Okay? Similar is true across the post-incentive period. Really small point estimates and nothing statistically significant at conventional levels. So these are really, really tight zeros. Okay? So we can really rule out any meaningful effects in this context. So as I mentioned before, the point estimate on paying on time and in full is about half a percentage point, and our confidence intervals rule out effects of greater than 1.3 percentage points on on-time repayment. And this is relative to a control mean of about 90%. The DMP dropout point estimate is a tenth of a percentage point. Our confidence intervals rule out effects of more than a 1.3 percentage point reduction in programmatic dropout. So again, pretty tight zero. The control mean here is about 16%. An estimate on balance reductions, less than $50. Confidence intervals can rule out debt reduction of more than about $150, on a base of about $12,000 of debt. It's really absolutely no causal behavior change going on whatsoever, no causal effects on any of the dimensions we would think would be most likely to be affected. And here, is if we break it down at a monthly level, really tight zeros across the board. If we compare this graph to our selection, there's really, the story here is large effects. If we looked at it in a correlational sense, there's large selection effects, but this is our large correlational effects, but this is driven entirely by selection. And I think the difference here is pretty striking. We have consistent zeros across the board. So I told you before that we thought that these incentives might be most likely to be effective for people that are new to the DMP and just making the behavioral changes required to be effective in the context of these programs. That's not the case at all. If anything, the effects are weaker among this 2016 cohort. The point estimates are even smaller. Nothing is remotely statistically significant. The same is true of 2015. 2014 cohort is a bit more interesting, perhaps, in the sense that we do see some evidence that consumers here are more likely to keep their account active if they're randomized into the incentive program. But this appears to be driven mostly by reductions in successful completions. Okay, so it appears that to the extent we modified behavior at all, it seems to be that among this group that's likely to be close to finishing the DMP, they're more likely to try to hang on and win a prize within the context of the program rather than paying off and completing the debt program in full, which actually is a value-losing proposition in this case, is the monthly service fee to remain in the program well exceeded the expected value of winning a prize. So not good news. So I'll move quickly through the debt reduction outcomes that we can observe on the credit report. And again, all of this is fairly precisely estimated zeros across 2015, 2016. Things get a little less precise due to our smaller sample sizes, but all consistent zeros across the board. So entirely, the story really here is we see large correlational effects, but everything is driven entirely by selection. So we can dig a little bit more into who it is that's taking up these incentives. And we find some evidence that those who take up the incentives have more to gain, in the sense that they have higher D&P balances at baseline, longer remaining on the D&P program, and have larger monthly payment amounts. But there's also, again, underscoring what I've been saying the whole time, is that people that are more likely to be good credit risks or pay out their debt in the future were more likely to take up the incentives. Right? So the best measure I have of future debt repayment success at baseline is the credit score, and takers had higher credit scores than those who did not take up, and fewer difficulties paying debt in the past relative to non-takers. All right, so to sum up, so in this study we find, similar to a lot of the non-randomized price-linked savings studies, that there is strong consumer interest and positive correlational effects from introducing these incentives into the debt reduction context. Takers are more timely with their debt repayment, less likely to drop out of the D&P, paid off more of their debt, and experience other positive outcomes on their credit reports, but absolutely no causal behavioral change whatsoever. So this is driven entirely by selection in our context. Our ITT estimates are really, really precise zeros. So consumers who are more likely to pay their debt successfully were more likely to opt into the incentive program. So we have some suggested evidence that these incentives may not modify behavior and may simply reward individuals who are going to engage in this type of behavior anyway. So like any randomized field experiment, there's questions about external validity, right? So it's not immediately clear that this will extend to a price-linked savings context or to another debt reduction intervention. But I think one thing we can say is we really marketed the hell out of these incentives, right? To a degree that's going to be quite difficult for many organizations in the field to replicate. And even in that case, we see huge selection effects. To the extent that there is a group that might benefit through causally changing the behavior by participating in this program, it's likely very, very difficult to reach these people. So I'll stop there and say thanks.
Pleasure of discussing this paper. It was really interesting for me to read. And here's what I have to say about the paper. So just to sum up a little bit, this paper does an RCT on price-linked debt repayment programs. Basically, what's the population of interest? It's people who go to this debt repayment program firm. They want to package all of their credit card or unsecured debt into a single monthly payment that's going to help them pay down the debt faster and better and without the organization. The authors randomize people into a lottery, so either you get offered the lottery, you take it up or not. You do this across 3 cohorts, people who signed up in 2014, 2015, 2016, so you have variation in how far they are in the process. And basically each time you make a monthly full payment on time, you get 1 entry into the raffle for a $500 prize each month, and 1 entry into the grand prize of $10,000 at the end of the year. Among the group that has been treated, there's about 75% who take up the product, 6% who say a hard no, I don't want to participate, and there's 20% who don't answer. The findings, I think, were very well explained by Jeremy. There's basically no findings on ITT, intent to treat effects, but there's strong self-selection effects. Basically, people who do take up the program increase their on-time behavior, on-time payments behavior. They're less likely to drop out of the program, and they reduce their debt more than people who did not take it up. So the takeaway is, well, be cautious when you interpret these price-linked savings accounts in the field that have not been randomized, because it could be the case that it's actually people who self-select into these programs that benefit from them. How does that fit in the literature? Well, there's a big literature on these savings, price-linked savings accounts. So we know there's general interest in those accounts. There's lab evidence that they seem to work. There's a little bit of non-RCT field evidence, a little bit of RCT field evidence. And what people find is, well, it's a product that's popular among poor or constrained households. It does seem to increase the amount saved. and could substitute for gambling, which is something we would like. I think another important part is this whole literature on how do I pay down my credit card debt. So how do I do it? Should I nudge people into paying a higher percent of their credit card balance each month? Should I straight up increase minimum payments and just force people to pay down their credit card balance faster? Or is there some kind of heuristics or behavioral story about how people pay down their credit card? And then this also fits in another literature on what's the best way to restructure bad debt. There's a lot of papers on the mortgage home affordability modification program where you try to give people principal reduction or change their monthly payments in the hopes of helping them to pay down their debt. And there's also a paper by Will Dobie and Jay Song who actually uses the same service provider as Jeremy, the same guys, and they actually look at if you come into this debt repayment program and I vary the type of benefits I give you by joining this program, so maybe I reduce your principal amount more, or I reduce your monthly payments more, what's the best way to structure a debt repayment program to make sure people are successful at it? What's the contribution of this paper? Well, I think that in essence it's the first RCT that does this price-linked debt repayment study. It's in the field rather than in the lab, so we have real decision, real outcomes, we have credit bureau data, administrative data, so we're really measuring real behavior. And I think the important contribution again is that we should be cautious when we evaluate this non-randomized evidence on price-linked savings account. The authors don't find any evidence that these programs would have causal effects. So it could be that the results that we see currently in the literature that study non-randomized price-linked programs are in fact due to selection. So that's my take on the paper. I have a few suggestions to help improve the paper, maybe a few reflections that we could have. I think the first thing is we need to think about the incentives that we have to take up the program. So I have the numbers here. Basically, you have one price of $500 each month. That's one monthly payment, roughly, which is, it's real money. One price of $10,000 at the end, it's about 2/3 of your balance, of your DMP balance. Now, the probability of winning depends on how many people sign up and make on-time payments. So people who sign up for this program and who are incentivized to make payments are incentivized by an uncertain lottery, so they don't know the probability. So I think we need to think about which type of people would be incentivized into this program given a lottery that has probabilities that are unknown. The expected payoff, which I would calculate, is you have one chance over 3,500 people who signed up, who were offered, let's say, the program. One chance of getting $500, it's about an expected value of 14 cents each month. And a chance of $10,000 is $3 one time at the end of the program. So I think we have to keep that in mind when we evaluate what's the effect of this program. So the first thing I would like to say is, well, it's a paper about self-selection. So what can we say about who takes up the program? I think already there's hints in the paper about it might be that people who knew they would complete the program are more likely to take it up and therefore more likely to succeed. And here I'm wondering, can we do a bit more? So my understanding is that people got many emails, many calls in order to take up the program. And if we think it's a story about, well, I'm well organized, I know I'm going to succeed in the program, I read my emails, I have my financial life in hands, well, could we compare people who take up the product on the first email? The first time I get the email, I read through it and I say, oh, I want to join this program. Could that signal that I'm someone who's better at managing my finances, or at least that pays attention to these things? So if we could compare the effect among people who take up the product, let's say the guy who answers on the first email versus the guy or the woman that answers on the 6th call when we've called them many times, where the intuition would be, if this hypothesis is true, people who answer on the first email might have better outcomes would take up. Now the alternative would be, well, people who take up the program are weird people who like uncertain lotteries, maybe they like gambling. I'm not sure how we can disentangle all of the behavioral factors, but then what we would like to know is, are these people substituting away from gambling? And that's going to be hard to do. There's this paper you mentioned by Cole, Iverson, and Tufano, and what they do is they basically say, well, you randomized access to the program in many different weeks, starting in 2016. One thing you could do, which might be a stretch, but you could look at state lottery jackpots and see, is take-up of the program higher in weeks where the lottery price is lower at the state lottery, and that, at least according to Cole, Iverson, and Tufano, could suggest that you're substituting away from gambling. So if you're more likely to take up the product when the state lottery jackpot size is small. All that to say, I think if we had a little bit more information, or if we could dig a bit more on who self-selects in the program, that would help the paper. My second comment is about the optimality of staying into this program. So I think the debt repayment program itself seems like a good plan to pay off your debt. Now, whether it's optimal to pay off your debt or default on it is maybe a different question. But I'm really thinking about, is the incentive of this lottery, is it optimal for you to stay in the program only for the lottery that you're giving these people? So the thing is, as you mentioned, there's no penalty for increasing payments on unsecured debt. So you could always pay down your debt faster if you had the money. Now, when you stay in this program, you have to pay between $50 to $50 each month in administrative fee, which could hurt people that stay in the program only for the chance of winning this $500 monthly prize or the $10,000 at the end of the program. The other thing we know is the longer you stay in such programs, there's also a higher possibility that you get hit by a negative shock, which also could hurt people. So those are two ways where you could be hurt by staying in the program. And then I thought I had a smart way of figuring this out, but it seems like it's illegal. But if you could make basically the price contingent on the amount you pay back on your debt, then you would resolve these issues. Unfortunately, this is seems like it's not doable in the field. So I think once you look at all of that, if you really wanted to say, well, what do I learn about this paper and how can I generalize to other types of price-linked accounts, maybe people would say, well, were the incentives big enough? So I find no intent to treat effect. Is it because the incentives weren't big enough? And I understand here that you don't have variation in the incentive, so everyone had a chance to win $500 or $10,000. But I'm wondering if you don't have variation in how generous the repayment plan was. And I'm getting these insights from the paper by Wu Toby and Jae-Sung, who use exactly the same provider as you do, and they have descriptive stats that show among people who participate in this repayment program, the generosity of the program itself varies. So they say the principal reduction can increase from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of the distribution by $1,500, and the payment similarly decreases, the monthly payment decreases by $30. Now, again, might be a stretch, but could you leverage this variation in the generosity of the program to think about, well, this $500 I might win could be relatively smaller for people that have a less generous repayment plan, and vice versa. So if you could leverage this variation, maybe you could see, well, does it affect take-up? And could I even use it as an instrument to measure the causal effect of the program take-up on the outcomes? And then again, I don't know if you have access to this data, but this is something you might want to look for. I have smaller questions I'd be happy to talk with you. So I was wondering, why not compare all of the groups in one integrated regression where I could see take-up versus not being offered, refusing to take the program versus not answering. I don't know if you have the power to measure all of these things, but that's something that could be interesting for the reader. Now, this is not always kosher, but even in your ITT framework, could you look for heterogeneous effects? So could you see subgroups of the population who might have causal treatment effects depending on their balances, depending on their credit scores, depending on the program length or when they signed up for the program itself. So that might help find effects where it seems there's no effect on average. And finally, I think the credit bureau outcomes, the number of missed payments might be cumulative. I suggest maybe having a measure as, do you have any new missed payments in this month, or the number of new missed payments in this month might reflect the story a bit better. So those are the points I had for you, and we're happy to open the floor for further discussions, and you can answer to this discussion and answer the questions from the floor.
Great, yeah, thanks. Those are helpful comments. I really appreciate it. One thing to say about the size of the incidents. Yeah, they're in absolute value, they're small. Expected value, they're small. But they're all bigger than many pricing savings initiatives. So to the extent that we're testing things that look like things that appear elsewhere in the world, we are doing that. Maybe there would be bigger effects if the programs, the size of the prizes were larger or the pool of participants was smaller. I don't know. We could only had budget to run one iteration of the incentive structure. But I think it's an interesting question to test going forward. Yeah, on the differences of selection of who opts in via email, phone, or auto dialer, I have more to do there. About a third of people took up via emails, about 10 to 15% took up via auto dialer, about half took up via phone. I haven't done too much, but they look broadly similar in terms of outcomes. But there is definitely more to do there, and I do think it's interesting. But great, yeah, I've taken a bunch of notes, and those are helpful.
Maybe you have a different take. It seems to me like what you've identified is that really there's no effect of this treatment on the outcomes for these people. So it's not effective in that sense, but it's a super effective treatment if your goal is to get people to reveal their types at very low cost, right? So, so this is for $4, you can get someone to tell you if they're going to default or not. And
yeah,
so in that sense, this is terrible for welfare because it means that you're opening a Pandora's box of adverse selection-based selling of the loans of non-responders to someone else and the holding of the loans to our responders, right? So it seems like what's super interesting about this category of interventions is it creates the scope to increase the private information of the servicers at the expense of other participants in the debt process.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I could work both ways too, though, right? So if we get people to reveal their types, and it's not a really just a nonprofit like MMI, and they can then devote more resources to people that are more likely to default, right? So it's not necessarily that they're just going to kick them out of the program or focus just on people who are not going to default. They could use it in the manner you're suggesting, that really focus on screen out people they think are going to default at the outset. But
I mean, if you're a nonprofit, if you were to extract money from people you sell the securities to, you could use that to help poor people. So it's not. I mean, the fact, and it's you have an established heterogeneity in the benefit of. You just identified who's more and less likely to default, not who is more or less likely to make good use of an intervention. So it's not clear what you would do with it there. But whether you're a for-profit or a non-profit, this is great information to extract wealth from third parties you sell the debt to.
Yeah, there's certainly a strong signal in terms of future outcomes, right? From picking up these things. Yeah.
Angrist and Indens 94 says that you can use randomization in the eligibility as an instrument to reveal the average treatment effect on the treated here.
Yeah.
Which you haven't done. You focus on the ITT, but it seems you can do a little bit more. I'm not saying you'll find anything. But,
so, we have done that. It's not in the paper, but it's exactly like you'd expect. So things are inflated by the inverse probability of take-up, so 4 over 3, but everything is still pretty precise here.
Still don't see anything. Okay, good.
So I'm wondering, what effect size are you powered to identify? And so if you take the $50 reduction at face value, you know, you're spending $3, you're getting a $50 reduction in debt. That seems to be a lot more effective than things like matching. And so is this noisy because the sample is small and you're not powered to identify it, or is it because the effect is just zero?
I can't get back to slides, but actually the effect is it's positive on balance. So if anything, it suggests that they're paying down less. So they have a $50 higher balance than control. But I mean, I have to go back and calculate exactly, you know, what dollar amount we can detect. We can detect $100, $132 differences. Right? We can rule out effects larger than that. So I think those are pretty small differences for such large balances. But your point is a good one, that, you know, relative to the amount expected value and prize for each individual, that is larger than, you know, the $2 or something per program participant this thing is going to cost them.
So maybe I missed these outcomes, but one or two outcomes in the take-up of the program is conditional on how long they have been in the program and how long they still have to go, or how long they are expected to go.
No, so I mean, we're just looking at broad take-up. I'm in your view.
Well, it's in the sense of depending on where you are in the take-up of the lottery, how long you have been part of this program.
Yeah.
And how long, basically, you are expected to go until you are tax-free to the end of the program. Maybe are you just a starter, or are you close to the finish line, or where are you in this program?
All right, so we did randomize them throughout 3 cohorts, right? Those that were just new to the program, those are 1 year in, and those are 2 year in.
It could be a measure of your participation.
Oh, take-up in terms of, yeah, so I had a slide on that, I can't get back to it. There's take-up was a little bit higher in the 2016 cohort than the 2 earlier cohorts, but I think it was like a 5 or 7 point difference across the take-up in the highest cohort and the take-up in the lowest cohort. So it wasn't hugely different, but there are some differences.
The other comment that I had was you motivated this by contrasting into the literature on savings, or building savings. And it seems to the economist mind, it seems to be the same. If you're building net financial wealth, then reducing debt and building savings seem to be 2 sides of the same coin. But in terms of winning lotteries to reduce debt, for some people that might seem a little bit interesting. You win the lottery prize and then your debt is gone.
Yeah.
You cannot spend out of your lottery winnings.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I was interested in also randomizing whether this was on devoted directly to your debt, or whether this is going to be like transferred into someone's pocket. But the lawyers also shot that down. So we can only pay it towards things that already contractually agreed to do, just pay down their debt. So we couldn't send them any checks. But that may have different effects, right? If it's cash in the pocket as opposed to a paper write down of their debt, it certainly might have potentially different effects.